Well, it's time for the fifth and final video that I'll record for you in this first week. It's our final video on the three worlds of the text, and I want to talk with you about the way my cultural context, or yours, what we have called the world in front of the text, can either hinder or help us as we read and interpret and try to understand the meaning of a biblical text. I also want to offer a few suggestions about ways we can become more sensitive to our own cultural context as we stand in front of the text and read it, and how we can learn to make use of a diversity of interpretations that come to us from outside our own cultural context. So to begin with, let me go back and repeat part of what I said to you at the end of video number 2 in this series of videos. There I used an illustration from Matthew chapter 15, a story in the 15th chapter of Matthew about the faith of a Canaanite woman who asks Jesus to drive a demon out of her daughter. You remember the story. So, how can the world in front of the text hinder me when I read and try to interpret this story? What are the possibilities that exist that my cultural context may allow the text to mean less to me than it should? Well, first there's cultural anachronism. That's something that I and you need to be conscious of and watch out for as we read the New Testament text. I mentioned cultural anachronism as I told you about my experience of teaching an audience in a church I pastored as senior pastor and asking the question the disciples thought at the end of the story of the woman at the well but didn't verbalize. The one that John says they all wanted to know was, why was he talking with a woman? And at that point, a woman in my audience in the congregation where I was teaching asked me, well, why shouldn't he be teaching with a woman? Why wouldn't he? That's a great example of reading our cultural context, the context from our world of time and space and culture, back into a New Testament text. That's what cultural anachronism is. And it's easy not to notice when we're doing it because we fall into it naturally. It's natural for us to assume to some extent that the world really hasn't changed that much. That's the way the saying goes. But when you're talking about the cultural world of the first century and the cultural world of the 21st century, a lot has changed. Another reason cultural anachronism often hinders me or you from allowing the text to tell us all it wants to is the reason that although we're conscious of doing it, many times it happens to us unconsciously. We aren't even aware we're doing it. To guard against that, I find it safe as a practice as a New Testament scholar, when I read a text, not to assume that I know anything about the cultural context, and I need to ask lots of questions about things I don't know, and even some questions about things I assume I do know. I hope you will learn to do the same thing, because it has almost always opened up for me, and I think will open up for you, new insights that will help you understand the New Testament text you're reading and interpreting more fully. Now, besides cultural anachronism, there are other features of my cultural context, the world in front of the text, for me as I read the text, that can hinder my interpretation of the text. Let me remind you of some of them. There's my gender. My identity as a male. My gender identity allows me only to read the story from a male perspective. And my cultural perspective as a 21st century American adds to that, so I'm at a double disadvantage, both historically and in terms of my gender. The good news, though, is that I can choose to do something to help me compensate for these cultural deficits. In terms of knowledge, I can seek to expand my knowledge by researching and seeking to gain knowledge about women in the first century. As I do, I will want to realize that I need to know not only about their role in Jewish culture, but their role in Samaritan culture, and probably Greco-Roman culture too, if I think that some of John's audience included Gentiles, as well as Jews and Samaritans, and I certainly do. In this way, I can compensate and seek to understand more about the woman at the well. But there's another way I can do this too. I can seek out opportunities to read women who have written commentaries on the story in John 4. I can talk with women who are friends and colleagues about their interpretation of the story. And I've done that over my years studying and teaching the New Testament. And I've found that conversations and resources that have been pointed out to me by women have greatly enriched my understanding. I hope if you are someone taking this class and sharing a gender with me, if you're a man, you'll learn to do that too. And if you're someone taking this class who doesn't share my gender, a woman, I look forward to interacting with you and hearing your insights from your gender context, your cultural context as women, as we move through this course together. Now, I could, in the same way, talk to you about other factors that are part of the world in front of me, the world that shapes my understanding of a New Testament text, because any of them can hinder me, or if I take the time to try and overcome them, they can help me understand the meaning of the text more fully. Let me mention a couple that come to mind for me, to encourage you to think of ones that might come to mind for you. Things that you will need to keep in mind that are part of the world in front of you and that influence the way you read and interpret a text. Geography and history help to shape my cultural context. I was born, grew up, and mostly was educated in America. But I spent a very important 3 years of my life as a doctoral student seeking to complete a doctoral thesis in England, in Nottingham, and in Cambridge. And those 3 years helped to shape my cultural context, because often as I read the text, I will remember things that I learned from that part of my existence, and they will help shape my interpretation. So I've tried to make sure when I can to broaden my perspective and read authors or talk with colleagues or students who come from another geography, history, culture, who have a different set of existential experiences to bring to the text. My race and my ethnicity help shape my cultural context too, the way I read the text from the world in front of the text. I've had the happy privilege to discover and use one of the textbooks you're going to read in our course. It's titled True to My Native Land. I discovered it several years ago, and I've used it in New Testament intro ever since. It contains, as you'll find out, essays written by African American writers from a variety of perspectives, but that very variety, that diversity, will help you appreciate some of the diversity in African American Black culture and African American New Testament interpretation. And students on all sides of this racial ethnic difference have told me how much they appreciate the chance to see how a cultural context different from their own, if they are Caucasian, or even the same as their own, if they are African American, how these different ways of interpreting the text offer different ways to consider and discern its meaning. I could go on like this. I could talk about how my cultural context has been enriched by Asian American New Testament scholars, or Hispanic New Testament scholars, or French, German, Australian, or South African New Testament scholars. I could talk about how encounters and conversations with people from different socioeconomic statuses than my own have brought me many insights into the New Testament. But I think you've caught my point. So how would I like you to make use of what I've been saying to you as you approach the text from the world in front of you and write interpretive papers in this course and other courses that you'll take at Fuller? Let me encourage you to do that in 3 ways. First, take time to think through the factors that have shaped your own existential perspective, your own cultural context, the factors that shape the way you read the text standing in the world in front of it, the way you interpret it existentially, the way that you interpret it growing out of your experiences, your history, your identity. Make a list of those things. And then second, Take advantage of the way this course and other courses in your time at Fuller can broaden and diversify your own personal cultural context. As you write papers, seek out perspectives that will help you broaden your own perspective. But third, realize as you do that you will agree with some of what you read or hear. You will disagree with some of what you read or hear, and that is all right. But even in things you read that you disagree with, there may be something to gain by helping you discern why you disagree. And when you disagree, ask yourself, as I often do, a question. Do I disagree with this because I see a deficiency in the way it reads the text from a historical or grammatical or literary or theological perspective? Or do I disagree with this because it's so different than my own way of reading it, my own cultural context? Because asking and answering that question will help open you up to the work of the Holy Spirit, who is working always with us and in us as we stand in front of the text in our world and read it, seek to interpret it, understand it, and pass our understanding on to others. And taking these 3 steps, learning how to interpret the text from the world in front of it, can enhance and deepen your understanding of the New Testament. Make use of women interpreters as well as men interpreters. Make use of people from different cultures and different geographies. Make use even of people from different historical periods in the interpretation of the New Testament. Make use of patristic interpreters. Make use of interpreters from the Reformation period who've commented on the text. Make use of commentators from the 20th century as well as the 21st century. Well, I hope you've enjoyed these first video lectures from me in our course. I'll be offering others to you along the way, and I'll also be offering you videos that have been made by many of my friends, acquaintances, and colleagues in New Testament study as they help you move through our course in New Testament introduction. But for now, and for this first week, I'm going to say goodbye.